This is the third time I've tried to film this video. The first time it just really sucked, and then the second time iMovie decided to shut down on me for no reason while I was filming, and so I lost all of the footage I had taken thus far. And I have a feeling that I might regret making a third attempt now because I am extremely tired. But I want to get this done. I finished reading this book 3 days ago and I want to review it, so we're gonna give it a shot. Here we go. Before we get to today's book review, I do want to tell you about a couple of other book reviewers on YouTube. Now, I've already told you about Meredith. I am the bookie in One Dose Daily. I've already told you about Anne Galaraloth. And of course, there's that weird guy that vlogs from his car. What's his name again? I will reiterate, of course, that you should go subscribe to those people if you have not already. But I'm going to talk about somebody different today that I found just recently. First, we have Completely Novel. CompletelyNovel.com is actually a website, basically a website for everybody who loves books. And they have a YouTube channel which consists of these twin British girls who do what they call rapid reviews. These reviews are around 3 minutes long and generally all in one take, which is pretty impressive, I have to admit. I mean, I babble on for 6 or 7 minutes, and that's only after I've edited myself pretty thoroughly. But at the moment, last time I checked, it only had 13 subscribers. 13 subscribers? 2 British girls reviewing books in 3 minutes in one take have less subscribers than one American guy reviewing books in 6 or 7 minutes with a whole bunch of editing? I actually got all of that out. Wow. This will not do, so I urge you all to go and subscribe to Completely Novel. Also, you may remember a while back I reviewed Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events. Well, I am not the only one. Crazy Driver 8 has also reviewed the series, but he has done a separate video for each of the individual books, and he has done it far more concisely than I have. I also think he's reviewed a couple of other books outside of the Lemony Snicket series, so go check him out as well. And now, on to the review! This evening's book review is Mary Called Magdalene by Margaret George. Now, I've talked about Margaret George's novels a little bit on my Vlog Driver book reviews. Margaret George is an historical fiction novelist. She has written 5 books to date, and each of these novels focuses on a person that has either been overlooked or maligned somehow by history. Mary Magdalene, as it happens, falls into both categories. We know precious little about Mary Magdalene. The Bible gives us very little to go on. And so Margaret George has given us a very intimate portrait of her life. The book is divided into 3 parts, and so therefore will this review be. The first part tells us about Mary's life before becoming a disciple of Jesus. Margaret George decides to give Mary a fairly ordinary life for a Jewish girl growing up in those times. She's a part of a very strictly religious family. She grows up with them in this little fishing town of Magdala, gets married, has a daughter, and tries to live as ordinary a life as possible. And so this chapter serves to give us an historical background for the rest of the story. In addition, we get to see relatable traits in Mary's character. So we get more than just the name Mary Magdalene in text. We actually get to see Mary as a person that we can relate to. And this section also begins to illustrate a theme that runs throughout the novel. It shows just how narrow-minded and exclusive many of the Jewish people were during this time. Her family's chief concern is that she not be an embarrassment to their very strictly religious way of life, which is not unlike many Christians today, and that's the parallel that I think is being drawn here. In part 2 of the novel, we learn about Mary's time as a disciple of Jesus. We see the story of Jesus from his baptism to his death and resurrection from the point of view of one of his disciples. And so we get the Christian story without it becoming preachy, which is a trap that many inspirational novels fall into. They become preachy. This book does not do that. Partially because it's looking at the story of Jesus from an historical context rather than a religious context. But also because Mary and the disciples did not agree with every word that came out of Jesus' mouth. They had their own selfish desires, they had their own faults, they had their own doubts, which again are all very relatable. And because we get the story from somebody who's right there, not as it's remembered years later, but from somebody who's actually right there, we get a different context for a lot of the words and the deeds of Jesus that we hear about. And sometimes the context is not quite what we would expect it to be. And the last part is basically the book of Acts from Mary's point of view, from the time when she saw Jesus resurrected onward. We see the beginnings of many of the modern day traditions and rules of the church, and also many of the divisions that began to start during that time. But more than that, we're asked to think about how right each of these things were, how right it was that there came to be a church hierarchy and all of these rules and traditions to follow. And if maybe that isn't what led so many Christians to become just as rigid in their rule following as the Jews were of Jesus' day. Now, all things considered, I had really just one main problem with this novel on my reread. The first mention of Mary in canonical gospel says that she was possessed by 7 demons. And so in the first part of the novel, Margaret George shows us how she came to be possessed by those demons before Jesus drove them out. And that section probably would have been more interesting to me if they had been more metaphorical demons, like representation of faults, or if there had been some other explanation for her possession. But she becomes literally possessed. And I don't believe in literal possession, so I found this in an historical novel a little bit jarring. But in the end, I didn't mind that so much, because the thing to remember is that this isn't really an historical novel, it's a biographical novel. It's told from Mary's point of view, in Mary's voice. And so if the narrator of the story believes that she was possessed by demons, then she is going to say, I was possessed by demons. And so because it's told from Mary's point of view, it's going to reflect Mary's beliefs. And Margaret George does this with all of her novels. For instance, in Helen of Troy, Helen actually has a conversation with the goddess Aphrodite. Now, whether or not you believe in Aphrodite or whether or not Margaret George believes in Aphrodite is irrelevant. The point is, Helen believes in Aphrodite, and Helen believes that she conversed with Aphrodite, and so that is what is portrayed in the book. And so there you go. Mary Called Magdalene by Margaret George is still a favorite. And in recognition of the movie coming out in I think a couple of weeks, the next book on the list is Angels and Demons by Dan Brown. It should be a pretty quick read. So I'll see you next time.